Every idea, every story starts with a spark, a tiny light that glows. But to speak up, to be heard, to innovate takes courage. We're here to ignite that tiny spark. We're here to foster Canadian voices, our narratives, our ideas. We're here to spark courage. Our logo is a showcase for our culture, our storytellers, our innovators, and it reflects our creators and communities. The Spark is a catalyst to push boundaries, to drive the future, and for Canadian voices to be heard on a global stage.
Since I was a kid, I wanted to make movies.
I love the writing process because you can go anywhere with it.
I've always been interested in the acting aspect.
I just have so many stories to tell myself.
There's a lot in me, a lot of creativity.
I see a lot of things happen in my community that I believe should be spoken about.
Many people are going through this every single day.
Bullying, poverty, racism. Wake up, people, something is going on.
Every new voice counts and matters.
When you're writing your screenplay, you don't want to have to think about formatting. Final Draft 12 automatically formats your screenplay to industry standards, allowing you to focus on what you do best, writing. Final Draft, used on 95% of all productions, contains many features that make your writing process easier and more efficient. Writing your script is as quick and easy as hitting Tab and Enter. Don't bother reaching for that mouse. Use Smart Type to cut down on keystrokes by auto-filling commonly used names, locations, and more. Use the Beatboard and Outline Editor to do all your story planning in one place for easy access throughout the writing process. Plan set pieces, store character research, and much more. The Beatboard gives you total freedom to organize your ideas as they come to you, all within your Final Draft file. The Outline Editor gives you a high-level view of your script, allowing you to easily plan and preview your scenes. Insert images on title pages, in the script, or even in the Beatboard to help visualize your story. Collaborate simultaneously with your writing partners in real time, around the corner or anywhere in the world. Use track changes to see and accept or reject edits made by collaborators to the script. Use alternate dialogue to store as many different versions of lines as you can imagine. Night mode lets you work in an environment that's easier on the eyes. Focus mode gives you distraction-free writing, hiding tools when they're not needed. Final Draft, the #1 selling screenwriting software worldwide, also offers the Final Draft mobile app for iPhone and iPad, making creativity truly portable. Bring your story to life with Final Draft 12. It all starts with a script.
Hello, and welcome to the Future of Film Showcase's 2021 festival. My name is Eric Bizzarri, and I'm the co-founder and artistic director of the festival. Today, we are joined by Rod Butler, the Director of Programs and Policy at the Canada Media Fund. I'd like to start by acknowledging the land on which we gather and organize is the territory of the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, the Huron-Wendat, and the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation. Today, the meeting place of Toronto is home to many Indigenous peoples. A territorial acknowledgement can demonstrate a coming to awareness and provoke thought and reflection, all of which are essential in beginning to establish reciprocal relations. This acknowledgement should not function as a closure. resignation, or acceptance of the structural conditions of settler colonialism that remain in effect today. The Future of Film Showcase will continue to ask what it means for us to keep open a spirit of sustained inquiry into the complexities of our context. FOFS would like to thank our presenting partners, CBC Gem, our public funders, the Government of Canada, Telefilm, and the ArtsVest Business and Arts Program. We would also like to thank our media partners, Playback, Touchwood PR, and Astrolab Studios. And now we would especially like to thank one of our industry partners, the Canada Media Fund, for their support of FOFS and graciously providing us this panel for our FOFS industry program. We'll have some time for a Q&A at the end. Feel free to comment in the chat on our YouTube event page here. Our team will look and pass your questions on. Without further ado, I am honored to introduce Rod Butler, the Director of Programs and Policy at the Canada Media Fund. Rod, how's it going?
I'm doing okay. It's a pleasure to be here. Again, this is always, when we do panels, we're always so thrilled to be able to explain some of the complexity, unfortunately, to our program. So again, we hope to have a lot of questions, and yeah, it'll be a great session. Absolutely.
And thank you. And on behalf of us and our audience, we appreciate you being here and coordinating this panel with us.
For sure.
So let's get right into it. You'll share your screen?
Yes, for sure. Okay, thanks a lot, Eric.
Awesome, no problem.
Basically, let's start off in terms of talking, what is the CMF? The Canada Media Fund is this big pile of money where hopefully we can fund your content. We get this money from two distinct players, the public side and the private side. So the public side is, of course, all of us. It's taxpayer money. It's the government of Canada. And the private side, though, is the distributors of cable, satellite, and IPTV. So that's, your Bell Media, your Rogers Cable, a percentage of your cable bill, whoever still has cable, goes to the CMF and other funds. And that's happening via an order through the CRTC. And so, when I go through all the rules today, oftentimes, you're going to go, Rod, that seems really silly. Why is that still a rule in 2021? Oftentimes, like most things, it goes back to, we get paid by these two separate spheres, and depending on who's paying our bills, that's usually why a rule is crafted a certain way. And so, especially with regards to, TV right now has changed dramatically in the past, let's say decade, how we watch television, what television really even is anymore. And so we're still constricted a little bit by this older model because we get paid by the distributors of the older model. So that's just kind of a little bit of pulling back the curtain in terms of our rules. We're really trying to push for more change and latitude, but there are a lot of interests and it's taking a lot of time to try and reconcile and make sure that we're all moving forward on the same page. So this is who gives us money. Our budget this past year was $364 million. So a lot of money. What do we do with it? So how do we give this money out? The Department of Canadian Heritage at the Government of Canada has a contribution agreement with the CMF. This is basically this binding document that sets the general rules and parameters for how we give out money. This is not just Rod Butler with a feather writing down rules. This is basically the sandbox we're able to play in is distinct and finite. And so the three areas that we support are promotional through events like this today. This is a way we can give out money and support the industry. A second way is something that we recently got latitude in a few years ago called the Sector Development Program. This allows us to support initiatives for training, mentorship, capacity building, for emerging artists, people in the regions, equity-seeking groups. So this allows us a lot of latitude in terms of how we give this money out, but it's a very small percentage of our overall program budget. The vast majority of money, overwhelming amount of money that we give out is through programs. And so I'm going to show you all the various programs that the CMF currently has. I apologize in advance. We didn't start out this way, but this is something that is grandfathered over time. Every program is a new way to try and reach out to an area of the industry that had been underserved. But like most things, over time, when you start to grandfather and layer in, it turns into kind of a Byzantine web of rules and programs, and it gets to be pretty complex pretty fast. And so we're under, the mandate now. We're trying to simplify our programs a little bit, try to make it a little bit more user-friendly and straightforward and a bit more clear. But as you can see, that's going to be a little bit of a process. You'll notice, so outside of international, which is, these are partnerships where we, approach another region, nation in the world, and a funding body there, and we try and leverage our money. That still represents a pretty small amount of the CMF's budget. The two primary streams in the CMF are the convergent stream and the experimental stream. The convergent stream is effectively our linear television stream, and that has the majority of the CMF's budget is in the convergent stream. This is for your television shows that you see on a broadcaster. This is anything you see on Bell or Rogers or on CBC, on Chorus, etc. The experimental stream on the other side, this is more of our digital media side of our programming. And so this is predominantly interactive digital media projects like video games, virtual reality, apps, but there are some linear programs too. But again, you can see there are many programs. This is how we give out money. You have to look at the guidelines of each distinct program to understand what the rules are. They're opaque at times, but again, as part of the public side of our mandate and our funding, we have to be as transparent as possible. So this can't just be Rod Butler behind a desk saying, I think this project has merit or that one. We have to be, these are the guidelines, these are the criteria on which you'll be evaluated. We have to be beyond reproach in terms of reporting where the money went to the government of Canada and our private funders. And to say that we're doing this on equal footing. Everyone has an equal shot at this money. So moving to the convergent stream specifically. So how do you get money? Well, first of all, as an applicant, you need to be an eligible one. So that means you have to be a for-profit company. You have to be controlled by Canadians. You will find as you go through our guidelines, there are so many boxes that have to get ticked. And this is, I'm just kind of glossing over the really big, bright light ones, but there are so many rules that we encourage, read the guidelines, read them twice, read them a third time, call our administrators at Telefilm, ask a lot of questions because it can be overwhelming. But these rules are there so we can say, this is everything you need to know, or hopefully most of what you need to know. And when we report on where that funding went, we can say it was given out and distributed according to these guidelines. In terms of eligible projects, I mentioned many boxes that have to be checked. But in the convergent stream, yes, we're looking at linear television shows. We only support them in 4 genres: drama, doc, kids, and VAPA, variety and performing arts. The convergent stream, the reason why it's convergent is projects must be multi-platform. So it has to be online or on TV, or it can be on TV with an accompanying digital media element that's used maybe as a promotional vehicle. So again, look at the guidelines, but you must have that convergence in the convergent stream. Goes without saying. The final point that I'm going to draw your attention to, and that's why it is caps locked, bolded, underlined with 2 stars at the end of it, is you need a broadcast license from a CRTC licensed Canadian broadcaster. This is what we call the quote unquote broadcast trigger. So this is the big gatekeeping function in this program. The CMF wants to support things that will be made available to Canadian audiences. And the Canadian broadcasters bring those shows and that content to Canada, to Canadian, viewers and eyeballs. And so the point of contention right now is, as the industry has changed, Canadians watch TV from sources much broader than just Canadian CRTC licensed broadcasters. And this is the period of transition that we're in, to try and give more latitude, more allowance for the gatekeeping function to unlock CMF funds. So moving to our selection process. So once you're eligible, let's say you're a Canadian company, let's say your project is eligible, how do you actually get chosen to get money? So I'm going to start at the bottom here and then I'll move up. So we obviously have first come, first serve programs. Those are exactly, the first one in, as long as you check all the boxes, you're going to get money. You hopefully will get the money that you ask for, but if the demand is severe, we oftentimes, because we're oversubscribed, we have to prorate how much you want. So if you wanted $100, but tons of people came in, you may have to say, okay, I'm going to get $80 on my project. Even though I applied the first day, there's so many individuals and companies that applied that I'm going to get a portion of the money that I needed. So that's something you have to keep in mind. You're not always going to get exactly the amount that you want. The second way is a selective program. So this is just that. We have criteria to be evaluated that we publish. Sometimes this is done by an independent jury. Sometimes this is done by the staff at the CMF's program administrator at Telefilm. And basically, we rank the merits of your project based on the criteria that we publish. So this is something I think people are often frustrated by, because they think their project's amazing, they apply, and they may not get chosen for funding. And this is something that maybe we can circle back to eventually with Eric and his questions. But the CMF funds the projects based on the application. So even if your project is phenomenal, like we've never seen anything like it, if that is not translated into your application, we can't see the future. We can't see inside your head, your vision, your genius. And so it needs to be put on paper. And I think what I always tell anyone that's thinking to apply to the CMF is, it's your job as a producer, even though your job is really challenging and really hard, and I don't envy any of you, to make it impossible for the CMF to say no. It's your job to do all the research, read the guidelines, a million times, ask questions, and make sure your application package is airtight and vacuum sealed, and we would be fools to say no. And so I think sometimes there's a dissonance in the project could end up still being amazing, but just when you applied, your financing wasn't in order. You didn't read the guidelines and there were omissions or defects. You didn't communicate actually what the pitch was in a compelling way. All of these elements go into whether we're going to give you, hopefully, a lot of money. So I would say to anyone out there that's listening as a producer, it's your job to make it impossible for us to say no. It's also your job to know where your strengths are and where your weaknesses are. And if you're not great at communicating or applying for, funding grants or any sort of funding, that's where it may be better to, if you're going to do it, get everyone, family, friends, to vet your application and give you criticism and feedback in advance, or hire someone that knows how to do that. I know not everyone's in a position to hire a person, but in terms of the risk and the reward, how much you're paying them versus how much you could get, people have to do that kind of evaluation in their head in advance of applying to a selective fund at the CMF. Finally, the envelope. So the envelope system represents the vast majority of funding in the convergent stream. This is an automatic system where broadcasters get an envelope of CMF money that will go up or will go down based on how they perform against the factors that we laid out. So I put that quote at the very top. This is akin to, as a kid, your allowance will go up if you bring home a report card with all A's. And if you bring home a report card with Fs, your allowance may go down. And so there's a typo here. We used to have 5 PE factors. Now we have 6. So as of 21-22, we've introduced the diverse community production licenses factor. And so broadcasters, again, on their licensing patterns, on if they, license content from diverse communities, license content from the regions, how they actually perform in terms of their audiences on traditional television, all of that kind of goes into the soup that we evaluate. And the following year, if it's CBC, their envelope will be X based on their performance. So that's where the CMF and bureaucrats like me, we are not choosing your project at all. You are making a pitch to a broadcaster to ask them, you have an envelope of money from the CMF. If I apply and you like my project, you effectively unlock that envelope that the CBC has. They can't spend it on whatever they want. The CBC can't go buy a boat with that envelope. They need to invest in projects. And so if you're an eligible project that they want to be in business with your project, they will commit a certain amount of money and then unlock their envelope. So that's just kind of to demystify what you'll hear the envelopes mentioned a lot. That's how that process works. It's the broadcaster that has access to an envelope. They have to almost find a good match of how they want to spend that CMF money. So I'm going to move on here now. What type of money are we giving you? And what are the strings that are attached to that money? I think it comes up a lot. So we give out a lot of different types. And so first, the repayable advance is often in the convergence stream in development. So we will give you something where no strings attached. If it doesn't move into production or the property doesn't move to another producer, like if the script moves to a producer, you have to another one, you have to pay us back. Or hopefully, if that project in development moves into production, you have to pay us back the repayable advance the first day you go to camera. So that's a good news story. Like once you go to camera, it's repayable. That means you're on the right track. You're moving into production. A non-repayable contribution is effectively just a grant, and we give this through some of our, I think, export funds. It's a bit more rare. We used to give this a lot more when the DM component was a bigger element in the CMF's programming. I'll go down to the last one next. The equity investment is just this. The CMF will become an equity investor in your project. We will have a share of recoupment and hopefully profits if your TV show is successful. And the third one I want to mention is the license fee top up. And this is, again, I would say, if you don't take a lot away from this rambling talking head today, I would take this away. The license fee top up, if you don't know what it is, has a real special status that you're going to want to pay attention to. So this effectively tops up that license fee that we talked about earlier on of a broadcaster. But the difference is it's non-repayable, so it acts as a grant, but it also has a unique status in the income tax regs in the sense that it does not grind your tax credit. So all this other financing and incentives and initiatives that you may get back from the government of Canada or a provincial agency, they're all deemed, quote unquote, or most of it is deemed assistance under the income tax regulations. The license fee top up is not deemed assistance. And so what that means is, once you get a certain amount of assistance, the government says you're tapped out. You can't get any more. It's not like we're going to pay for 100% of your project and then give you 80% more for you to have a discretionary fund. That's what the grind means. As soon as you get to a certain amount, the next amount you get will diminish your previous amounts. The license fee top up does not grind. This is basically something that you as a producer will want the license fee top up. And that is in the convergence stream, usually the first amount of CMF money. So depending on the program, this is getting into the weeds very fast, I apologize. But when we give you money, the first percentages of that money is in a license fee top up. After, let's say in the performance envelope program, after 20%, your CMF contribution type changes into an equity investment where we're actually investors in your project. So oftentimes the CMF will see a lot of 20% CMF because then we're not in your pocket, investing, taking out our share of investment when the project does kind of make revenue and profit. But license fee top up, I would kind of highlight that as something very special. If you don't know enough about it, I would look that up more, but that is a very favorable contribution type. And again, the amount completely varies by program. So you saw that initial chart, all those programs in the convergence stream. It's different based on if it's development, if it's production, if it's a certain type of production, if it's a selective fund, if it's a first come, first serve. So look at the guidelines. It's another great excuse to just say, this is why it's really important to kind of read all of our rules and policies. So I'm going to move to the next slide now. This is just an overview in terms of what are the current issues that we're facing. So the Broadcasting Act and Telecom Act were under review for the past little while. That was hopefully going to be able to iron out a lot of the issues facing the CMF eventually. The primacy of the Canadian broadcaster in our system, the sources of CMF funding, like who's paying our bills, and how much emphasis is going to be on domestic versus international. The Broadcasting Act, you know, depending on what you hear, was not ready by the time that Parliament just went on recess. We will see what happens in the fall. We will see if there is an election or not. But I would say right now, that's a big asterisk in the sense of we are not sure the trajectory of where the Broadcasting Act review is going. And so that in turn will affect our timeline for the CMF to implement some bigger reform packages. Diversity inclusion is obviously huge. You know, this is something that the CMF has not done enough on with regards to racialized groups. We always had diversity with regards to language, region, but I think creators from racialized communities have not historically had the same amount of avenues in to the CMF's programs as other groups have, and that's actually shameful on our part. I think the past year has been an education for a lot of organizations and agencies, and so what the CMF did this past year in April, we had a consultation last summer. We introduced almost like a 4-prong approach. I mentioned the PE factor was one of those prongs in that approach. We created something called the Pilot Program for Racialized Communities, the PPRC. That is a program that has production, but that deadline is passed, but there is still a development and pre-development deadline that I believe is coming up September 14th, if I'm not mistaken. We also have carve-outs in our first come, first serve program. So in pre-development, in conceptualization, you know, there's a designated amount of those programs' budgets exclusively devoted to producers from racialized groups and Indigenous producers. And finally, in our selective programs, there are points given for applicants from those equity-seeking groups. So we tried to kind of have a holistic approach of there are some requirements, some incentives, and it's something we're going to build upon. I know that in the next few weeks, we're going to be doing a consultation with the LGBTQ2+ community and people with disabilities. So I think diversity and inclusion is something that's so important to us. And it's something that we've really not addressed in a significant way to a few really important groups that we're trying to address now. In terms of simplification versus, you know, all the constituents and clients that we serve, this is really tricky. You know, the guidelines are complex and opaque, and you've seen our programs. This was done, you know, with good intentions to try and reach as many different stakeholders as possible. But that has created such a complex hornet's nest of rules and carve-outs and caveats that if you're an emerging producer that's new and starting your career, it can be overwhelming. And so we're always trying to find that balance of simplifying our programs, but you can't make them too simple because a documentary producer in Kelowna, BC is going to be different from Entertainment One, big budget scripted drama producer in Toronto is different than a Montreal-based games producer in the French language market. And so we're trying to find like programs to make sure that there's as much alignment and symmetry as possible. But I would say this is going to be a continuing task. Finally, cultural versus industrial. This is something where, you know, we receive money from both the private and public spheres. We're always trying to balance. We want to promote projects that resonate, you know, on a mass basis, that are commercially viable and successful, that give us a return on our investment. But we also have a mandate that's cultural, that we want to make sure the projects that may not be as commercial, you know, those storytellers and creators still have a voice, and that if we're north of the biggest media producer in the world, we need to ensure that all Canadians have an outlet to create and tell stories, because we're a big country. And I think that, you know, ensuring the Canadian voice and culture is still alive and well as everyone kind of can consume content from around the world is really tricky. And I think you're going to hear a lot more about this from me and other panels that you attend. But, you know, maintaining Canada's cultural voice and defining what Canadian culture is, I think, is very personal. I think different people see it, you know, in very different ways. Many people don't care about the cultural voice of Canada until you talk to them about something that they really care about very deeply. And so I think it's something that we're trying to make it more accessible so it can resonate to more Canadians. And I think we're trying to look at more flexibility, so our conditions are not as strict and there can be more collaboration, that you would see that project as, oh yeah, that was a collaboration between Ireland and Canada, and they produced this show that was amazing, that was seen across the entire world, or something like a Schitt's Creek that wins Emmys. You know, those are things that we're very proud right now about those shows, just because I think for a long time Canada was this sequestered, you know, people associated Canadian TV with lesser than. And I think right now we're trying to make sure that it gets enough investment to compete on the world stage, because that's what Canadians are watching. They're watching content the world over. So if we're going to compete, we need to make sure it's the very best. Anyway, so that's the convergent stream and the kind of issues facing that stream now. The experimental stream, I won't spend as much time on just because it is significantly smaller, but it is our interactive digital media side. There is a web series program, the digital linear series program. There's a partnership with the Shaw Rocket Fund. So there are some linear elements there, but it's primarily this interactive digital media fund. We fund projects on the interactive side at conceptualization, through to prototyping, to advance that kind of progress. And eventually you kind of split into an innovation project or a commercial one at the production stage. The Accelerator partnership program is kind of unique. It's a mentorship capacity building program that's very specialized and unique, but I would read the guidelines. If you're a DM producer that wants to get tutelage and hopefully some help from more established producers, I would look at those guidelines on our website and look at the list of accelerators that we list on that program page to see if that could also be a fit. Again, the applicant, no shock here, Canadian. We get money from the public purse. We have to fund Canadians and their companies. We also fund Canadian broadcasters directly through this stream. The project, the underlying rights have to be controlled by Canadians, produced in Canada. And this last one, connected to the Canadian cultural sector. This is not defined by design. So cultural, we've kept it broad. Obviously, it's for the applicant to try and make a case. And this means that it could be related to art, dance, literature, song. Like we're looking for as wide a definition of culture as possible, but it still has to be tied back to that. Oftentimes we find, let's say, tech companies that are doing something completely not related to culture, that they see the CMF has money and try and wedge their non-cultural project into our program. And unfortunately, it's not possible. So I think this next slide talks a little bit about ineligible projects in the stream. So if it's a corporate, industrial, or promotional, like we're not there to have, to do an app for, Tide Pods, right? It's cultural projects, curriculum based. We're not there for educational purposes, research and development. There are other funds and grants available to R&D. Casino type games, we do not fund. Repurposed material, of course. And then this last one is we've seen this in the last few years, the gamification of non-cultural projects. So this is where someone is studying, an app that helps study autism in young kids, but the app is a game, and they're saying, oh no, it's a game, but it's research for another peripheral purpose. So we see that all the time. So what we're looking for is cultural projects that are innovative or commercial. And that's really the spirit and intent of what this stream is trying to advance. Again, the types of money we give depends on the stage of project. So repayable advances, recoupable investments. The amounts, again, check the guidelines. It all varies by each program. In terms of the current issues here, diversity and inclusion, again, top of that list. It's something where we have not done as good a job as we should have. And so we're definitely being very aggressive in that sphere now. Our equity, diversity, and inclusion strategy and plan really has, a lot of milestones that are kind of holding our feet to the fire to try and make representation as wide as possible. We have a lot of work to do still in terms of data collection on these groups, just to even know what programs we need to create and for which groups. But it's something that we've really fast-tracked this past year. Representation on another side, in terms of the experimental stream, Quebec has historically dominated this stream, and that's for a host of historical reasons. And so this is something that we're always looking to balance out. We want to get applications from across Canada. We want Ontario, but we want BC, we want Atlantic Canada, we want everywhere in between. And so this is something that we're trying to iron out too. It's this, we want to fund the best projects. And so if the best projects that year happen to be from Quebec, then we have to fund those projects. But we also want to make sure that we create an environment where the best projects are starting to come from other places too. And I think that's on us in terms of our education and our communication strategies. In terms of project diversity, we see a lot of games. And so we're trying to also have some balance in terms of the software, the applications, the virtual reality, but games has definitely been kind of the dominant type. Measuring success has been very hard. We've looked at revenues, but I think we're going to look at a little bit more of a holistic picture of what equates to success in this stream. So those are the current issues in experimental. Obviously, a lot of overlap with the convergence stream. And finally, I think we're getting to a point where I'm going to wrap up soon, but our international incentives are just another element of our programming strategy, where I said it off the top, it leverages the CMF's funds. And it also achieves a wider audience, and it helps us obtain lessons and learnings from other parts of the world, where it's like, oh, if we can maybe cherry pick that program that they did, or that's a great rule that we can, put in our programming. I think it's always great to kind of expand our horizons as a funder, just to see if there's anything that we can utilize that maybe Australia is, or New Zealand, or France, or Scotland, or Brazil, or wherever. So it does act as a complement. So we obviously kind of, have a lot of audiovisual treaty co-productions, and those are, again, in production. So The incentives tend to focus on both development and digital to act as that complementary lever. This last slide, these are just, again, a sample of who we've had some international incentives with. And I would check our website right now for the active incentives for this current fiscal year. But I think that is everything in terms of my slideshow. I've said a lot in a very short amount of time. So I'm going to push it back to Eric here, and maybe we can have a discussion of new things, or we can unpack a little bit of what I said.
That was a great presentation, and we have an audience here. So I'm going to give it some time and allow people to sort of collect their questions and everything. And again, our team is standing by for anyone that has questions. They'll be passed on to us. So in the meantime, while we're waiting on those, I guess the first question that I had, and I was hoping that you, I guess, some advice that you could share is like, what sort of advice would you give to young creators approaching funding applications for the first time?
It's a great, it's really fair, because I think sometimes, again, I mentioned it in the presentation, it just, so many producers that I've spoken to and that call telefilm that actually are the recipients of the applications, they don't read everything through. And I think they want this kind of secret path, or they want to know the real way to get funds. And it's really a cliche, but it's do the work, read everything through. And it's a lot, and ask a lot of questions, but give yourself enough time to ask those questions. The amount of questions telefilm still gets, the day that it's due. It's just like being back in high school. Like, if you don't understand an assignment, if you go to your professor the day it's due, you're not going to get as much help as if you go a month prior. And so I think it's just that kind of general life advice of read it all the way through. It's complex, ask a lot of questions. And I would say that would solve, not everything, but that would solve 90% of the grief that we get from kind of newer, more emerging producers. The other thing I would say is, not every program, like if you're new and emerging and you look at the evaluation criteria, let's say in a selective fund, and they're going to evaluate your team, or they're going to evaluate you as a producer in terms of what you've done, and you've never done anything, putting an application package together is a lot of time, and that time is money for a producer. So I would say, be more strategic in what you apply for, in terms of, there are other programs, oftentimes in development, where the barrier to entry seems to be a bit lower. It's a bit easier to get funds. The applications are less onerous. And so I would say, if you haven't done anything yet, but listen, you're still talented and you want to, progress in your career, I would say focus on those development type of programs, just to give yourself an easier shot. And then that success will lean into and beget more success. So I think that's sometimes a bit of an unforced error. I think when people just say, I want this funding and I'm applying, and then it's so much work and they don't know what they're doing, that they put in an application, invariably don't get funded. And then I think in some of our experimental stream or programs there's a cap on how many times you can keep coming back. So they've already ruined one of their opportunities. So it's just good life advice. Read it all the way through and ask questions, and then also be more strategic and a little bit more discriminate in terms of which programs you think is the best fit for your company at this stage.
Absolutely. That's great advice. I was definitely sometimes someone in high school who would wait till the last minute, and I learned that.
Same.
That hard.
You're in good company. Yeah.
There you go. That's really solid advice, because a lot of the times we even find similar things for people submitting to our festival and submitting to festivals in general, right? Reading the terms and conditions, reading the guidelines, understanding, do I have a shot at this? Does my project fit within the requirements of, in this case, the funding application, or in our case, let's say our festival that screens short films. So I guess that my next question is, what do you find is sort of like the key, or is there a key element missing from most funding applications? Is there like a commonality there between what's missing?
I wouldn't say there's a commonality other than, again, not to flog a dead horse, but just in terms of the commonality is people haven't read all the way through. And so for a variety of reasons, there's just a defect that is not a mystery, that's there in black and white, but they just completely missed it. And because again, our guidelines can be a lot, and there's a lot of information there, but it's honestly like we've done this dance where it's like we try to strip our guidelines down, and then there's a lot of questions about what about this, what about that, because it's not in our guidelines. And then when we have our guidelines kind of in a more thorough, robust version, it's overwhelming, and there's so many rules, and they're like, this is just like, this is crazy. So we're hopefully trying to find a balance. It's difficult though. It's really difficult because again, you know, you're not writing for a homogenous audience. You're writing for the experts, and you're writing for the newbies and everyone in between. And so you're trying to be as clear as possible. But I think that's why I would always say, you know, if you're new and emerging, it's a lot, and give yourself that time and then call. I think sometimes people are shy to call, or they think it's a burden, or they'll be evaluated in a different way, or like, oh, or they're pestering. But it's like, it's not pestering if you're doing it in a, you know, you can't call and say, tell me everything I need to know. But if you do your homework and due diligence, and you have questions that are thoughtful and intelligent, and say, I understand, you know, X, Y, Z, but on this, you know, fifth element, what am I doing, you know, A or B? I think if you're having an honest conversation with an analyst at Telefilm about, I'm not sure about this form, or I'm not sure what this rule means, I think they would rather, you know, it is more work for them to remedy a defective application than to help and maybe handhold a bit on the front end. So I would call them, again, with enough time. But I think there's this shyness or timidness if you're starting out. And I would say, as a Canadian producer, if you have that, I would abandon that very fast, because it is so competitive. And as a producer in Canada, you're going to have to combine all of these incentives from all these different places in this kind of patchwork quilt. And you're going to have to get bold and hustle very fast. Like this is not a job for the meek. And so I would say, get bold, get hustling. You know, this is not rocket science. So in the sense of you don't need to be an expert, but you need to do hard work. And I believe most people can put that hard work in if they give themselves enough time. So what we don't want to see at the CMF is, we didn't fund an amazing project because the application was awful. Like we want, you know, we look better at the CMF if we fund amazing stuff. If we didn't fund an amazing piece of work because that producer gave us, you know, something on the back of a napkin that wasn't what we asked for at application because we have rules, that would be the biggest shame, because then that project didn't see the light of day, or it took a longer time, or whatever it is, and we weren't a part of it. Like, we want to be the mechanism of, you know, to help that project see the light of day. So that's why we're telling you this. That's why we do these panels, to try and hopefully, you know, it's a lot of work, but demystify it as much as possible. But to kind of stop this ramble, there's not one thing. It is this kind of variety of different little things. But the biggest thing I would say is just call and have a conversation, and hopefully it can help.
Yeah, and I think, just to echo off of that as well, like we're in a business of relationships, right? And that's been so interesting, I guess, about COVID as well, is removing those in-person experiences. And of course, you know, our festival prides itself on being able to convene in a theater, have that collective experience, right? Not only watching movies, but also attending our industry events and everything. And I think now more than ever, we really understand that. And I also think that, you know, just in terms of what you were talking about, you know, people, let's say, being shy to call or ask questions, it's like, you know, that sort of, I feel like, separates those from others, right? Is people really having the ability to go up and say, hey, how are you? My name is so-and-so. I'm the, you know, this is my position on this project. What can I do? Or how can I sort of engage in what you're able to provide, right? And
exactly,
I think that's what people look at the most. And again, just going back to that, sort of the business of relationships and executing and nurturing and fostering relationships is most important. We actually have a question coming in from one of our viewers. Their name is Jamal. So their question is, does the CMF fund feature films or just shorts? But I guess that was also in the presentation, but maybe.
Yeah, no. So again, I this is where we will fund either. There's some fine print here, but again, it has to be attached to a broadcaster. So the amount of broadcasters doing shorts right now, again, I don't want to speak to it. It can still happen, but I think that market has changed in the broadcasting landscape a little bit. But again, we do fund feature length films with the ... provided there's a Canadian broadcaster attached. And so, what the broadcaster has to put into that feature, if you look at our guidelines, there's a whole, I didn't really get into these weeds, but it's like the broadcaster can't put in $1 and you unlock $1 million. Like there is a threshold of what they have to put in based on the type of program, the type of genre, the type of language market, the length of the project, if it's a series or a one-off. So there's a whole grid in our guidelines to kind of see what you need as a commitment from a broadcaster. But to answer Jamal's question, yes, we would fund both. I don't, in terms of shorts, again, we would technically fund it. I think there are some length restrictions in some of our genres, so it would depend on what the short was. But I would also say, I don't know the broadcasters these days, that are licensing original shorts. There could be some, and I'm ignorant right now, but I think that market may be diminishing. And so it's not a question of the CMF doesn't fund it. It's the fact that the marketplace that we reflect is not licensing that as a type of content.
Of course. And I guess just to put it out there, CBC Gem does license shorts.
Okay.
And that's great. So Jamal, you could look into that as well.
Great.
The next question, how does the CMF specifically incentivize broadcasters to succeed internationally? Would it help if broadcasters had more to lose when developing shows that can't break an international barrier?
So if I'm understanding the question, the incentive is not for the broadcaster to succeed internationally. We fund projects. So the goal is the project. So the goal is, again, like the Schitt's Creek example, just because it's pretty recent. When that project started, it was fairly modest. And then after the fact, I think it was on CBC in Canada, it was on Crackle, I think, in the US. And then after a few seasons, Netflix acquired its rights. And then on Netflix, it found a bigger audience and took off. But this is, we want projects to succeed domestically, internationally. It's less, it's not as much about a broadcaster. I don't want to speak for the broadcasters, but I would say if a project does well internationally, it only helps their status and their, what am I trying to say? Their visibility. So if, again, the Schitt's Creek, because it's recent, when CBC is thanked at the Emmys, people go, CBC. So I just think that elevates the broadcaster status in terms of it's a big platform where they were mentioned, that helps, but it's more being attached to, at the end of the day, I think this is what the CMF is trying to get across. Not to be blunt, but it's not about the broadcasters. It's not about the producers. It's not about the CMF. It's about the content. We want to fund great content that finds an audience and that resonates. And that could be a niche, small cult hit in Canada, or that could be a huge internationally recognized show with a monster budget. But I think the point of all this is we want to make content is the priority. So whatever a broadcaster does, again, we care about the broadcasters, we need them, but that's not our concern. Our concern is the content. Whatever platform it is showcased on, that's great, but it needs to find an audience, either hopefully in Canada, but internationally too. And I think when I'm talking about oftentimes equity, diversity, and inclusion, I think this is where I've said this on many panels, so I apologize if this has been heard by members of the audience in the past, but in terms of when we're talking about participation of who gets to be funded and who gets a seat at the table. I think for a long time, equity-seeking groups and especially racialized creators have not had equal seating at the CMF's table at all. And you know, the CMF has done well, and Canada's industry has done well. But now that we're starting to emerge from people only seeing things in Canada, and we don't get, like, if we're going to compete on the world stage, if we're going to actually, you know, compete with things from Sweden and Spain and Japan, and because people can watch things from anywhere, and they are, if we're actually going to compete there, we have to have as many talented people at the table, regardless of what they look like. And I think if we're only historically hiring people that look like me, I think we're fighting with one hand tied behind our back on the international stage. Like, there are more storytellers with amazing stories to tell. There are more audiences that want something different than the status quo or what's been done. So I think when we're talking about the cultural and the industrial, I think if we lean into diversity, there's, outside of doing the right thing and making sure that representation matters, and that's what leaders do, there's an industrial argument there too. Like, there's money to be made by tapping into more resources and more different types of creators that haven't had a shot yet. And if we want to compete, that's, you know, not to be cliche, but diversity in Canada is our strength. And the more open we are to let those people in, the more of a shot we're going to have the bigger hits that resonate the world over and in Canada.
Absolutely. Thanks for that, Rod. And I guess just echoing that, my next question, sort of tying into this, is if you could explain, you know, what is the CMF doing now to increase visibility for diverse voices and stories from those in marginalized communities, and as such ensuring equitable practices across all programs?
So it's a great question. So I mentioned in the deck, it's this year was, so not I guess April 1st, 2021, but I think the year prior, April 1st, 2020, we started a diversity of voices carve out in our writers program. It's called the Early Stage Development Program. And so that program had, again, a designated carve out just to make sure we want these voices here, but it was just a start. And I think this most recent year was where we kind of built that out in a much more fulsome, strategic way. And I think, you know, when we created the PPRC, the pilot program for racialized communities, we saw that as a minimum. That was, I think, $10 million is the budget, I think, but that's basically saying this is guaranteed at minimum for these creators. The performance the factor in the envelope program, that's seen as more of an incentive. That's basically saying, broadcasters, if you haven't taken meetings from certain groups or people from certain groups, you now will be judged on the content you license, and the money you get from the CMF will fall unless you start to hopefully take meetings and invest in projects from groups that you, again, not to point fingers, but the marketplace was silent. Like we let the marketplace do its thing, and the representation was really abysmal. So we're now kind of being this, you know, artificial prompt of the marketplace to say, hey, if you want CMF money, start this, because your competitors are going to compete in this factor, and if you don't, you'll lose money. That's been the kind of, instead of a stick, that's the carrot, just to say, start taking these meetings. And even if you don't license that content, I think, you know, you said it, Eric, it's a relationship it's a business that's kind of framed on relationships and networking. And I think that just to get different creators in the room is going to, maybe it's not that project that gets licensed, but it starts a relationship where there's now, okay, I've seen that person, I like them, and they were great. And that wasn't right for us then because we didn't have enough money or it wasn't part of our fall strategy, but it's kind of put a bug in the ear of someone to say, let's open these doors a bit wider now. And so I think that's the starting point. We have, you know, a tremendous amount of work still to be done, but we wanted just to start and say, this is something that we all as a community in broadcasting in Canada need to first admit that we've done a really bad job at. And then secondly, once we've admitted that, say, how can we start things? And I would say this doesn't mean though that everyone from an equity seeking group is just going to be given a bundle of money next week. Like, this is something that still, we want the opportunities to dramatically change, but we still need, again, it's public money. We need to see what you've done. We need to either have someone from the marketplace say, I want to be in the business of this producer, or if there's no third-party market test, say, we need to see something. You can't just have started a business last week and say, I'm starting this. So it's this balance of there's systemic racism in the system that has stopped a lot of people from rising up, but we still need to balance. We need to look at what you've done. And so how the CMF reconciles these two tensions is going to be really tricky. In terms of other initiatives, I know that, outside of racialized creators, we know there's more to be done in terms of Indigenous and, again, we're doing the consultation with people with disabilities, LGBTQ2+, like there are more groups that have to be seen. The only other thing I would say in terms of a good way to track this is the CMF has not done enough with regards to, for a lot of reasons, both IT and legal, tracking the either ethnicity or the health status or the orientation or sexuality of any of its applicants because of privacy, health, legal reasons. We're starting to come up with a tool that hopefully we can start to track that data where it's on your project. Who is your actors? Who are your writers? Just to get a sense of who are the people, again, voluntarily offering up this information. And once we can determine who's actually on projects, and more importantly, who's not being hired on projects, I think that will give us kind of another tool in our tool belt to say, okay, we need a program now for the Black community, especially from racialized groups, is underrepresented a great deal, or people with disabilities are nowhere to be seen in our industry. So I think once we have that, again, hopefully that data online tool is available soon. But as soon as we get that, we also see that as another element, as another kind of component to help us make some policy that's data driven that will serve the community.
Amazing. And then we're just running out of time now. Just our very last question. Aaron, they asked, are there programs for script development? It's difficult to spend so much time writing a project with no guarantee of it getting produced.
So in terms of script development, I guess if Aaron is a producer, there's a lot of programs for script development. So there's the development envelope program where, again, you still need a broadcaster to say, I want to be involved in this. There's a pre-development program. I believe this year the deadline has passed, but that's a first come, first serve. Again, this is always the catch. You need a market test. You need a broadcaster, or I believe it's a funding agency to say, I'm going to give this project a letter of support. We're not in the business of just saying, here's money that we hope will one day get aired. Like we want to fund things there where there's already a partner saying, we feel this could see the light of day. If Aaron is a writer and not a producer, there's something called the early stage development program, which is for writers to do just what Aaron is saying. It's basically to say, you don't need a broadcaster. This is for a writer to hopefully get their great idea funded and paid for without that market test, just so we don't continually just see hospital, cop, or legal shows on TV, because those are what broadcasters want. So this is for writers to be as creative as possible. It's evaluated by an independent jury of writers. And so that deadline, I believe, is coming up in the fall, but I would check our website. It's the early stage development program, and that is exclusively for writers for writing.
Amazing. Well, again, Rod, this was great. Thank you to everyone who has come and watched this panel and interacted. We appreciated all your questions. Please be sure to research the Canada Media Fund, right? do the research, understand this is a business of relationships, and the CMF is here to help foster those relationships. As for FOFS, our short films continue to stream on CBC Gem until July 22nd. Once again, Rod, thank you so much, and thank you to the Canada Media Fund.
For sure.
Have a great day, everyone.